So for the first one, number 1, we're multiplying by the conjugate. So what is the conjugate of 3 minus root 7? 3 plus root 7. Top and bottom. So we have to rationalize our denominator. So what that means is we cannot leave a fraction with a radical in the denominator. So we have to eliminate that radical. So for the numerator, we have 5 times 3 plus root 7. And when you distribute that 3, you end up with 15. 5 times 3 is 15 plus 5 root 7. So that's my numerator. For my denominator, we're going to make a box. So we have 3 minus root 7 times 3 plus root 7. And we're going to fill in all 4 squares. Let me zoom in. So 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times negative root 7 is negative 3 root 7. 3 times positive root 7 is positive 3 root 7. And then negative root 7 times positive root 7 is negative square root of 49, which is negative 7. So notice that these two terms are opposite. So these two terms are opposite, so they're going to cancel. So this cancels out these two boxes. Oops, that's the wrong thing. Hold on. 1 second. Okay, so these two cancel out. So you're left with 9 minus 7. And what is 9 minus 7? 2. So my final answer for question number 1, I'll write it off to the side, is 15 plus 5 root 7 all over 2. Yes. Friday. So tomorrow I'm passing out the study guide. You have a skills check on Monday, but we'll talk about that at the end of class. Yes. I do not collect study guides. No. Mm-mm. And the reason why I don't collect the study guide is because I put up the answer key that day. So I'm going to give you the study guide and post the answer key, so that as you're working, you get instant feedback on if you're doing it correctly. So, I actually work it out and I post it. So because of that, I don't collect it for points, because you could essentially just copy my work and turn it in. Like, that's not the point of it. So, all right, let's look at question number 2. So we're following that recipe. So the first thing we're going to do, okay, and this should say equal C. That should say equal C, not plus C. So it should be ax squared plus bx equals C. So that C term needs to go over. So let's add 86. So that would be 6x squared minus 12x equals negative 2 plus 86, which is 84. Step number 2 is take the 6 out of only the terms on the left. So the terms on the left, these two terms, we're going to divide by 6. So that 6 comes out, and we're left with x squared minus 2x equals 84. All right, so now we need to complete the square. So step 3 says add b over 2 squared to both sides. So b over 2, this is now b. B is no longer negative 12. I factored out a 6, it's negative 2. So take negative 2, divide it by 2, and square it. What is negative 2 divided by 2 squared? Positive 1 or negative 1? Positive 1. Anytime you square a number, it's always positive. A negative times a negative is positive, and a positive times a positive is also positive. So we're going to add 1 here. And on the right, I have to add 6 times 1. Yes, because when you square a number, it is always positive. Yes. All right, so now we're going to factor this down. So we have 6, and then it's x minus 1 squared equals 90. What do you think we're going to do next? We have to get rid of that 6 in front. We factored that down. 2 numbers that multiplies to be 1 and adds to negative 2 would be x minus 1 times x minus 1. Divide both sides by 6, so we have x minus 1 squared equals 15. Take the square root of both sides, and you have x minus 1 equals plus and minus square root of 15. And your last step would be to add 1 to the other side, and this would be your final answer. All right, so we have reached the end of the road. Our last component or chapter is 1.2. So let's go ahead and draw a line in your notebook or title it, whatever you do. 1.2 is over intercepts and symmetry. Today we'll talk about intercepts, and tomorrow we'll talk about symmetry. So I'll give you a minute to copy that down. If you don't remember how to find the x and y intercepts, to find x-intercept, you set y equal to 0 and solve. And to find your y-intercept, you set x equal to 0 and solve. So I'll give you a moment to look at that or copy that down. We have 3 questions that we're going to graph and then 2 that we don't graph. right, are we ready to get started? Anybody need more time? Okay, sure. All right, so let's go ahead. We'll look at this first one together. So we're going to find our x and y intercepts and graph it. So 2y equals 3x minus 12. If you don't have graph paper, you can just try to sketch it out. Homework 5, I think I said you do need to turn that in on graph paper. The ones that are graphing, you have to have it on graph paper. So we're going to find our x and y intercepts. So when I'm looking for my x-intercept, the y becomes 0. So that would be 2 times 0 equals 3x minus 12. Go ahead and solve that equation for x. So 0 equals 3x minus 12. Add the 12 to both sides. (12) equals 3x. And then divide by 3. And when you divide both sides by 3, you get that 4 equals x, which can also be written as an ordered pair of 4, 0. So I'm going to go ahead and put a point on my x-axis at 4. So after you find your x-intercept, you plot that point on your x-axis. And now we're going to find our y-intercept. So our y-intercept is going to be 2y equals 3 times 0 minus 12. All right, go ahead, take a minute and solve that for y. So 2y equals negative 12. Divide both sides by 2. We get y equals negative 6, which can be written as 0, negative 6. Plot that point on the y-axis. So after you find your intercepts, you want to plot those on the axes. And then you draw your graph. Just connect it through with a straight line. I know my line isn't perfectly straight, but it's the best I can do on the iPad. And that's it. Homework 5, you have to graph by finding intercepts. All right, so let's go ahead and look at part B. Copy this question down, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to find our x and y intercepts. So I want you to notice how now we have an exponent, and because this exponent is squared, or x is squared, I should say, because our variable is squared, this means that we can have up to 2 x-intercepts. So we can have 2 different answers. There will be 2 answers. Sometimes that answer could be the same number. It could be imaginary, which means we couldn't plot it, but for this instance, you're gonna have 2 real numbers. So to find our x-intercept, we're gonna start by putting our 0 for y. Go ahead and add 1 and take the square root. So 1 equals x squared, take the square root of both sides. So the square root of x squared is just x. And then what is the square root of 1? 1 and -1, plus and minus 1. So you have an x-intercept at +1, and you also have one at -1. Go ahead and plot both x-intercepts on the x-axis. So put a point at +1 and place a point at -1. So I'm gonna go over here and plot my 2 x-intercepts. And then for our y-intercept, y equals, and then x becomes 0. Go ahead and figure out what that is. 0 squared minus 1. Y has a power of 1, so there's only 1 y-intercept. Y equals -1, which means you have a y-intercept at 0, -1. Go ahead and plot that, and it should look like a parabola, a smile. So it looks something like this. And that would be your graph.
So if it was like y squared, it would have 2 answers.
Right. If it was a y squared, then it would have 2 answers, 2 y-intercepts. So our last one that we're going to graph, we're going to do 2 more, but we're not going to graph the last 2. Let's go ahead and find our x and y intercepts. Go ahead and copy down this function. Take a few minutes and try to find your x and y intercepts on your own. And then we'll go through it together to see if you got the correct answers. So how many x-intercepts am I looking for? 2. And how many y-intercepts? 1. No, we're graphing this one. But the next two after this, we're not graphing. Okay, so let's take a look and see if your answer matches my answer. Who had a graph that looks like my graph? All right, good. So your x-intercepts are at positive and negative 1, and you have one intercept at positive 4. So this is a parabola, except this one is upside down because your y-intercept is above the x-axis. Yes, Deborah?
So the 4 outside of x squared, now we can do that as well with it.
Right. Yes, because if you multiply a number by 0, you get 0.
I think I did an extra step, but I did the square root of 4x squared equals the square root of 4. And then I got 2x equals 2. Then I only got x equals 1. I don't. Like,
So you want to follow order of operations and step backwards. So when you're solving, you want to divide before you take the square root.
Okay.
So it's like PEMDAS, but backwards. First you add and subtract, then you multiply and divide, then you eliminate exponents. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and keep moving forward here. We have 2 more questions. Now, we're not graphing these 2, though. We are going to find our x and y intercepts. So we haven't talked about a square root yet. So let's go ahead and copy down question A. So f of x is the same as y. So on the test, if it says f of x, that's the same thing as y. So I'm going to put a 0 right here. This entire term becomes 0. So I get 0 equals a negative times the square root of x plus 16 plus 4. And we're going to solve that equation for x. So the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 4, which gives me negative 4 equals negative 1 times x plus 16. And then I'm going to get rid of this negative in front because this is being multiplied by negative 1. So we're going to get rid of this negative 1 by dividing both sides by negative 1. So that would be a positive 4 equals the square root of x plus 16. To get rid of that square root, what's the opposite of taking the square root? Squaring. So that gives you 16 equals x plus 16. And when you subtract 16, you get that x equals 0. So that tells me that my x-intercept is at the origin. Whenever you get an x-intercept at the origin, that means that's also your y-intercept. But we're also going to solve it algebraically to just verify that is what we get. So to find our y-intercept, I have y equals negative, and then it's a 0 plus 16 plus 4. And that becomes y equals negative square root of 16 plus 4. The square root of 16, we're looking for the principal root, would be 4, so that becomes a negative 4. And again, we do get y equals 0. So for question A, both the x and y intercepts are at 0. And let's look at question B. For question B, to find my x-intercept, that would be 0 equals 16x squared minus 25. Add 25 to both sides. Divide both sides by 16. And then take the square root. And that's going to give you plus or minus 5 over 4. So you have two x-intercepts. One is at positive 5/4 and the other one is at negative 5/4. And then your y-intercept, you have y equals 16 times 0 squared minus 25. So when I square the 0, I get 0. And then 16 times 0 is 0. So this all cancels out. And you're left with just y equals negative 25. So your y-intercept is at 0, negative 25.